and welcome. My name's Steve Atkins and I'm the Program Director for the Silicon Trust, and you're watching an interview that we've created for the Silicon Trust Media Studios. Now, these interviews that we've created during a time of global pandemic and the resulting enforced work from home restrictions that many companies and their employees are currently find themselves operating under is our way of keeping in touch with our partners, the partner network, and communicating and informing customers, markets, and the industry as a whole. It's desk to desk, but it's also face to face until the time that we can once again meet in person. Joining me today is Dr. Joseph Atick. Dr. Atick served as chairman of ID4AFRICA, which he co-founded in 2014. Now, ID4AFRICA is an NGO movement that accompanies African nations on their journey to develop robust and responsible identity ecosystems in the service of development and humanitarian actions. The ID4AFRICA movement is driven by the need to establish identity for all, not just as a legal right, consistent with SDG 16.9, but also as a practical necessity to enable inclusive access to services in Africa. ID4AFRICA believe that service-orientated identity ecosystems built on the respect of privacy and human rights are essential for growth of digital economies and will become even more crucial as African countries move to implement the provisions for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So, Dr. Atick, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, in the past few weeks, you and the ID4AFRICA team have been running a number of webinars with a range of panelists, and the underlying theme has been the impact that COVID-19 has had on the many and varied identity programs running through the African continent. Listening to the panelists, have there been any surprises to you concerning this topic?
I think I would say the webinars have shown us a reaffirmation of many of the fundamental values and the fundamental missions that we've been working on. They've accelerated the demand for what we've been calling for. And if I were surprised, I would say I was surprised by the depth and the breadth of the impact. But by the quality of it, by the type of impact, I think we had expected that. But the depth and the breadth was beyond anybody's expectations.
Some have argued that the COVID-19 pandemics had a positive impact upon the need for identity programs as they become the foundation for health checks or track and trace, etc. What are your views on this train of thought?
For sure. Actually, the pandemic has made it clear that digital identity is not just a good idea. It's a necessity in the post-COVID era. In fact, governments who did not have digital assets like digital identity, e-government, payment systems, and payment platforms found themselves struggling to identify and deliver services and benefits and assistance to their citizens and to the vulnerable populations. So I think there is no doubt that this was a major boost to the argument that you need to identify people in a reliable manner, but also in a digital manner in order for them to participate in the digital economy, which what COVID has done is has catapulted the world as a whole 10 years into the future by accelerating that demand.
Let me ask a supplemental question for that. I mean, if we are talking about such a huge database that is being put together for these ID programs, who do you think should control such a database? I mean, is it a central department? Is it health? Is it border security? Who should actually look after things like that?
We believe that identity, there is a digital multiplicity of unique identity. There's a core identity, which is essentially just identifying you by a unique number and testifying that you exist and that you're not duplicated. And that database should be the work of a centralized authority and should not contain any information beyond what is required to establish your uniqueness. In addition, there will be in each sector, the health sector, for example, the financial sector, for example, the education, and so on, and social protection. Each one of them should have an identifier that might be derived from the unique identifier, but a sectorial based identifier. This is what we call tokenization. And in there, we can allow these organizations and these agencies to enrich their knowledge of this person through sectorial data that they need in order to deliver the appropriate level of services and the quality and the type of services required. So I believe the answer is not one gigantic database. We believe it's a collection of repositories of data, each of which is designed for a specific purpose and controlled by the user, so that the user can navigate and allow access as their requirements and as their needs call for.
Following the webinars, it struck me that many African nations have come up against the trade-off between attended and unattended ID authentication during this pandemic, perhaps even requiring a change in technology or hardware or even their approach. In your opinion, are these concerns valid in the long term, and will they have an impact upon projects already in place?
In fact, as soon as the pandemic hit, the first impact on identity projects was the suspension of the in-person enrollment. So all the projects in countries in Africa and maybe around the world have really slowed down or reached a screeching stop. They halted. And as a consequence, at the same time, the demand for access to services from governments online and at a distance was going through the roof, because people were needing to log in, to access information when bureaus were being closed. So in this contradictory environment, you can't enroll in person. At the same time, you're required to have a digital ID. So what do? We have no choice but to actually develop what we would call end-to-end digital identity. It's not enough to have a digital identity that you can use in a digital medium, but which was issued after you visited a physical place and somebody vetted you and screened you. We need the ability to onboard people digitally, to screen people digitally, and to issue them a unique ID number. And that raises an entire range of trust issues, because when a person is not there, you cannot touch them, you cannot have their fingerprints right where the bureau is, raises the question: are they synthetic? Have they stolen somebody's identity, or they're simply robots that are penetrating the national ID? So this is a requirement. It's not going to go away, even though the bureaus will reopen. And they will implement sanitization requirements where they will clean sensors, and they will implement contactless biometrics with face and iris and even contactless fingerprints. Even though all of these things are happening and there will be a reopening of all of that, the need for unattended virtual onboarding or self-onboarding is going to be here as an alternative channel that will accompany the in-person enrollment. And I think that's the challenge that you're going to have to overcome is something that the industry can overcome, that helps the customer overcome. And that's the challenge of trust. You need to deploy identity intelligence tools that are able to look at your social media footprint. You need to be able to access via video conferencing the applicant and reach out and ask questions as need be, so that you're not really a robot. You can prove that you exist. There's a whole range of tools that need to be put in place, and it's an opportunity for innovation. In fact, many of the development agencies now have put in place programs to motivate the development of purely digital self-enrollment. And I think we should see the convenience of that driving significant numbers of enrollments, even when the offices start reopening and people are able to go back in person.
Now let's change tack a little bit. The ID4Africa movement's very focused upon this Special Development Goal 16.9, which calls for legal identity for all by 2030. Now, do you consider that the recent pandemic to have impacted upon this SDG's outcome? I think what I'm trying to say is 2030 still an acceptable timeline, or should it in fact be shorter?
In fact, even before the pandemic, we believed strongly that the priority of developing countries was to develop service-oriented identity, which is an identity that's useful, an identity that can be linked to services. It's not necessarily a legal identity, consistent with 16.9, but we believe the starting point should be a digital identity or a service-oriented identity, which you can link to a legal identity down the line. So from our perspective, the need for digital identity and total coverage of the population cannot wait till 2030. Maybe legal identity can wait till 2030, and as a result, the SDG 16.9 may not need to be revised, and I don't believe there will be a chance for its revision. But we cannot wait till 2030 when it comes to digital identity or service-oriented identity. People are, it's becoming a question of life and death. People are being excluded from access. We have the haves and the have-nots, and it's creating a fault line between two sectors of society. So more than ever, it's not a question of rights-based, such as legal identity. It's a question of practical necessity for living in a pandemic, living under crisis, and even post the pandemic, we will have an economic situation that's going to favor people who are able to be agile, who are able to access services and link their life, conduct their life on a digital medium. So I believe we need to accelerate the digital identity agenda, which should be an end-to-end digital identity agenda, which means digital onboarding, digital screening, digital service delivery, digital authentication, and digital access. At the same time, we need to go back and ensure that we're not creating a new invisible generation. We need to make sure births are recorded, deaths are recorded, and we should take advantage of the fact that the health agenda now needs that important information, and there's a lot of funding for health programs. We should tag on to those programs to ensure that birth and deaths are being registered, but we should not rely on them to provide the useful identity, which is the digital identity. In fact, in one of the webinars that we've conducted recently, the World Bank, Robert Palacios, have called for acceleration to achieving the total coverage by 2022. And we strongly believe in that. That might be an optimistic goal, but we think if we don't accelerate the development of digital identity, we run the risk that many millions of people who are now going into poverty will be left behind even worse than before.
One final question, Dr. Atick. Now, you've been president of the biometrics industry for many years, and through both your work with the technology and your driving of the ID4Africa movement, you've got a reputation as an expert and, let's say, an industry observer in this field. What are your personal thoughts on the COVID-19 pandemic's impact upon the industry and the many pilot projects that were just starting to take off in the field of identity?
I think I have been fortunate enough to have witnessed all the milestones that have driven the biometric and the identity industry forward from its inception till today. And the COVID is not an exception. In fact, before in the 1990s, the driver for identity systems was facilitated travel. We saw that the world was arriving at a crisis because travel was increasing and the capacity was not there to support it. So simplified passenger travel with the use of biometrics and identity systems was the driver. E-passports was the child of that period. And I participated in the development of the e-passport, and we saw the impact of that. Then September 11 came, and I was there. I was at the front line, and we saw for the 2000s, the entire decade was driven by national security considerations, and the industry moved forward very rapidly, developed new technologies, etc. Then in the 2010, when I had left the industry and joined the World Bank, and after that founded ID4Africa, I was heavily involved before I left the industry with the India project, Aadhaar. And so it became the era of identity for development. So that's a value proposition. So if I had to say, what is the 2020 decade bring? I think it brings, with COVID, it brought in the public health as a driver for identity systems. So we went from facilitation to national security to identity for development, and now it is public health as a requirement for ID systems. The value proposition over the last, let's say, 30 years and going into the future, 40 years, is a solid value proposition, and it's not a single value. A human having an ID is an important necessity for living in a modern world. And that's why the call for identity for all is stronger than ever. And we have demonstrated the resilience, not of our mission as an industry, but of our mission as an identity movement, ID4Africa. We've adapted to what this pandemic has done. So even when we are apart, we stand together. We've been engaging with our community privately and publicly, and we've been driving the knowledge that is now being demanded for real world projects. We're not talking about nice to have developments and pilots. We're talking about must have and acceleration of those objectives. And I think one thing that I've noticed is the alignment of all the development agencies behind this goal. Before, we had some dialogue, we had some different agendas, but now it's very clear. Our goal is to look after, identify, and deliver services to the most vulnerable. And the sad story about COVID is that it impacted disproportionately society. It impacted the poor the most. And so the people who are on the borderline of poverty, they're dropping back down to poverty. And the people who are poor, they are going to drop even further into poverty. And those are the people that we can help through the development of identification systems and the delivery of services to them.
Dr. Atick, thank you very much for taking the time out to speak to us. Always a pleasure. Very, very knowledgeable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
That was Dr. Atick from ID4Africa. My name's Steve Atkins from the Silicon Trust. Thank you for joining us today.